afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Noyo Center for Marine Science coming to you live. Welcome to everybody who's joining us on YouTube for the first time. Hopefully it's going well. This is a talk in partnership with Sea Otter Savvy for Sea Otter Awareness Week, and we're excited to have you join us for the last in a whole series of talks. So I will introduce Heather in a minute, who can tell you more about that. But I just want to give you a brief rundown of Noyo Center. For those of you who don't know us, we're a nonprofit on the Mendocino coast looking to advance ocean conservation through education, exploration, and experience. We've been trying to address the kelp collapse for the last 5 years here, and have worked in partnership with many of you, probably that are on this call, hopefully, in trying to bring our kelp forest back. We're down 95%. And so the Noyo Center, as a small nonprofit, had to sort of meet this issue way before we were kind of prepared to do so. So we're happy to hear about some new research that Elizabeth is doing. So we have a great speaker today, and Elizabeth Carpenter. We'll talk about her in a minute. But first, I want to pass it over to Heather Barrett, who I call the Sea Otter Queen. So she comes from Sea Otter Savvy and has incredibly organized this entire week, and has really helped us through some of these live streaming issues. So it's really great to have a partnership like this. But before I turn it over, I just wanted to let you know that, as with nonprofits, it's always great to support us or any of the nonprofits that you're hearing in these presentations. It's hard to continue to operate in a rural coastline like Mendocino, and your donations and or memberships are always appreciated. So Heather, take it away.
My name is Heather Barrett, and I am a sea otter biologist, and I'm the Science Communication Director for Sea Otter Savvy. And I'm so excited to be here today. And you know what? It's great. It's the first time going live. There's got to be something. So it kind of makes it a little exciting and fun. So hopefully everyone bears with us. You will get a chance to watch this video if you missed the beginning. It will be posted with Noyo after. So there's always a chance to watch it. But I wanted to give you guys a little bit of background on Sea Otter Awareness Week. So it's a week that occurs every year during the last full week of September, and is organized in partnership with Defenders of Wildlife, Sea Otter Savvy, California State Parks, Alaka Alliance, and Monterey Bay Aquarium. And we thank all of our collaborators like Noyo that join us in spreading awareness for this week. This year marks the 21st year, and the theme is restoring missing links. So we're recognizing that sea otters remain absent from large portions of their historical range, while also celebrating the active efforts of conservation groups that are trying to restore continuous population of these charismatic creatures and other missing elements of the Pacific coast. We also recognize that sea otters have influenced the livelihoods, the culture, and the spiritual aspects of coastal communities throughout human history. Many of these communities have their own words for sea otter, including the few that appear in the inner ring of this logo. But we also want to highlight that Sea Otter Savvy's We Were Here Sea Otter program is highlighted during this week as well. And it educates communities and stakeholders who are missing sea otters, and we offer a survey for community involvement. The Southern Sea Otter Range is currently from Gaviota State Park in the south to a little north of Año Nuevo State Park in the north. And sea otters did once inhabit all along the Pacific coast, so they are ecologically and culturally significant. And there's an increasing discussion regarding potential reintroduction to historical habitats. To move forward, government agencies and the sea otter research community, we need to engage communities and stakeholders to hear from your perspectives. So if you are wondering what you can do today, please take the Sea Otter survey if you haven't already, and share your voices and thoughts. If you have questions, concerns, the links in the website and the survey are all going to be made available to you in the chat in just a moment, and then they will also be posted with this video. But with that, I would like to now introduce Elizabeth. So Elizabeth Ramsey Carpenter, she is an ecologist and a friend, and a kelp forest restoration specialist based in Monterey, California. At FishBio, a fisheries consulting firm based in California, Elizabeth works as a researcher and a science communication lead, acquiring funding and spearheading all aspects of a kelp restoration project aimed at testing a novel technique that has the potential to restore kelp forests on a much larger geographical scale than any other method to date. So we are really excited to learn more about this Spore solution during this event. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being here today. And I'm going to stop my share, and I'm going to hand it over to you. So take it away.
Thank you, Heather, so much for that introduction, and apologies to all for all of our little technical difficulties. It's part of being human, I guess. I wanted to make a quick shout out to the Noyo Center for hosting this talk, and a little shout out to Patrick Webster for my lovely background photo during my talk. All right, so Heather did a pretty great introduction, so I'm just going to jump right in. And if I can get my slides to move, that would be good. There we go. So I wanted to share a little bit of background on myself before getting really into the details about my project and kelp restoration in Northern California. So here in this photo, I have my friend and colleague, Dan Gossard. We both graduated from Moss Landing Marine Labs with a degree in marine science, but a specialty and focus in kelp forest communities. I work for FishBio, that fisheries consulting firm, and Dan works for a land-based seaweed aquaculture company called Monterey Bay Seaweeds here in Monterey. A little bit of a lag here. My apologies, everyone. There we go. And I just wanted to share clearly, Dan and I are both the perfect definition of a seaweed nerd. We're a special breed here, but we love it. So before I jump in, I just wanted to give you an idea of what to expect from my talk. First of all, I'm just going to introduce what kelp really is and why it's important to ocean ecosystems. Then I'm going to jump into the current state of Northern California kelp forests. Then I will talk a little bit about bull kelp restoration to date. Then I'm going to jump into the Spore solution, which is the project I'm currently working on. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up my talk by talking a little bit about the potential for sea otter reintroduction in Northern California and some of the dynamics that go on, because the system is actually quite complex just on the ecological side. But then we also have a lot of different perspectives from the community and all of the stakeholders involved. So we'll jump into that at the very end of the talk. So to start off, what is seaweed? So seaweed is actually a type of algae. And there's 3 different types of algae in the ocean. There's red algae, green algae, and brown algae. And kelps are a type of brown algae. I will say, if you take one thing away from my talk, that is it. Kelps are a type of brown algae specifically. So there are over 30 different species of kelps that we know of, and they can be found all around the world. And so if you look at this photo here, everything marked in red is where we have found kelp so far. So it's really widespread and worldwide. And kelp is considered a foundation species, meaning its presence is incredibly important to everything else that relies on it. It's provided food and shelter to numerous different types of species, and it's really essential to creating high biodiversity and just a really healthy ecosystem. So now let's talk about kelp in general. So there are 2 common kelps that form the beautiful kelp forest canopies along the California coast. They are bull kelp, which is the one on the left you see here, and giant kelp, the one on the right. You can find them both along the central coast, and they do overlap here on the central coast. But if you move further south, you probably won't find bull kelp as often. You'll probably mostly find just giant kelp. And if you move north, you'll probably only find bull kelp. There we go. So since our restoration technique is focused on Northern California, we focused our restoration technique on bull kelp. So why is bull kelp in particular so important to keep around in Northern California? Well, bull kelp forests are home to red abalone and red sea urchins, along with many other species, but those 2 in particular are both incredibly valuable fisheries in Northern California. But since 2013, we have observed a dramatic loss of kelp forest cover up and down the California coast, especially in Northern California, where up to about 90 to 95% of the kelp has completely disappeared. And there are a few reasons, a perfect storm, so to speak, that caused this rapid decline. First and foremost, in October 2013, the Pacific coast experienced the first warm blob. Now, an increase in about 3 degrees Celsius may not seem like that big of a difference, but in the ocean, that type of temperature swing can be quite the adjustment for mammals, for fish, and other living things that live under the surface, including seaweed. So I would say, imagine you're someone who loves the sauna, and you may love it for short spurts of time, but you probably will start to get pretty uncomfortable if you stayed there for maybe an hour or more, right? Basically, this is what the ocean experienced in 2013. The temperature of the ocean increased and then lingered at that temperature for a very extended period of time. Kelp ultimately thrives at 12 degrees Celsius, but once the temperature gets past about 16 degrees Celsius, their health really starts to deteriorate. The second player in the perfect storm was sea star wasting syndrome, which was also detected as early as June 2013. This disease quickly swept across the entire Pacific coast, targeting the ochre and sunstar species, decimating their populations and leaving them melting and dying in its wake. These two species of sea stars are considered top predators, especially in Northern California, where sea otters and other predators have been absent for over 100 years. Nature is ever changing and seeking balance, so when a massive die-off of a top predator happens, the entire system usually experiences an immense shift. So now let's talk about the purple urchin, the portrayed bad guy of this story. Purple sea urchins are actually a native species to the California coast, along with red sea urchins, red abalone, and other creatures that live on the seafloor. This means that they play a very important role in the ecosystem. In a balanced kelp forest system, urchins graze on the kelp that naturally falls to the seafloor. And when they are not looking for food, they rest or hide in rock crevices. However, as I said, the top predator, the sea star, abruptly dwindled and disappeared, and there was nothing else to stop the urchin populations from growing. Urchins love to graze on kelp, but when their numbers increase to an accelerated rate, the kelp just can't keep up. As the urchins continued to eat their fill, they ran out of kelp on the bottom and had to get food straight from the source. And in just a few short months, the lush kelp forest started to shift to urchin barrens, where bare rock was covered by very, very hungry urchins. When the kelp disappeared, the red sea urchin fishery collapsed along with it. Urchin divers were left high and dry, pun intended, looking for an alternative job that could keep them in the water. Since then, urchin divers have been very involved in the kelp restoration work. They know the area well, and they're determined to do whatever it takes to revive the place they once called home. As you can see here from this quote from Grant Downey, a very prominent urchin diver in Northern California, he says that the kelp restoration projects on the North Coast have been a subsidy for income loss, especially when the fishery crashed. And even though there has been some funding for kelp restoration that have helped keep them afloat, it's just not enough. They need the kelp forests to come back. So here's what Grant had to say when I asked him how dire the situation really is. He said, quote, "As a second generation urchin diver who started diving in 2008, I used to average 1,200 pounds of sea urchins in a day, and other divers would average up to 2,500 pounds a day. After the kelp collapse and disaster we have endured, I only averaged 300 to 500 pounds a day. Some days are spent just swimming over huge areas of barrens looking for harvestable urchins." Really dire. So how do we keep the urchin diver, or how do we help the urchin divers and the kelp? In order to find a way to help revive beautiful bull kelp forests in Northern California, we really need to understand how it lives its life below the surface. So bull kelp is an annual kelp, meaning that it grows from a tiny microscopic being all the way to an adult, all in 1 year. Although it is an algae, it reproduces similar to plants that we're familiar with on land. Instead of seeds, bull kelp uses spores, which are invisible to our eyes without a powerful microscope. So let's break down their lives into each season. In the fall, bull kelp releases billions and billions of spores into the water around them, and you can see that here. You can tell when they are ready to release their spores when they have dark spots on their blades, as seen in this graphic. Once the spores are released, they slowly start to attach to the rock at the bottom of the ocean. Between fall and winter, the microscopic spores go through a few processes that I won't delve into here, but they basically prepare themselves to get ready for spring when the days grow longer. In the wintertime, most adult bull kelp along the Northern California coast are ripped from their rocky homes and carried to the beach due to large waves and winter storms. At this time of year that we are in now, you may start to see bull kelp on the beach just like this. In fact, this last week, the Central Coast endured quite a bit of wave action, and this photo was actually taken on Tuesday. While the adults are getting deposited on the beach, the spores are happily attached to the rock, holding tight and developing. This photo on the right is a photo from a microscope, and it shows two corncob-looking buds, also known as sporophytes, that are in fact teeny tiny little baby bull kelp. I may be a crazy seaweed nerd, but I think these little guys are my favorite. They're so cute. By spring, the longer day lengths cue the microscopic sporophytes to grow, and we're finally able to start seeing the next generation of bull kelp. And as you can see in these photos, the little ones are also quite cute. By summer, those little sporophytes have rocketed to the surface, and we are treated once again with a lush and full forest of bull kelp. So, what are scientists doing now to help the kelp? Currently, the Northern California coast beneath the surface looks a lot like this. Imagine seeing a spiky purple urchin sea covering the rocky reef. An urchin barren is often referred to as a desolate wasteland with very little biodiversity, void of food, and much shelter. The goal of these restoration efforts are to try to assist in swinging the system from that urchin barren state to the kelp forest state and restoring the biodiversity. Even from these two pictures, you can see how much more alive the area on the right is when compared to the left. Now, most, if not all, restoration efforts have targeted and utilized one or more parts of the reproductive cycle of bull kelp. The spore bag method has been around for a while and has proved to be successful in restoring other species of kelp in other parts of the world. Typically, the method consists of removing the blades from the adult bull kelp with spores, putting a bunch in a mesh bag, and bolting the bag onto the bare reef. The hope is that the spores will be released over time from the bull kelp blades and establish a new forest. Seeding lines is also a common restoration practice where spores are collected and brought back to the lab. The spores are then settled on a rope or a line where individuals will grow up using the line as a substrate or a place to hold on to. Green gravel is another type of technique. Green gravel is gravel that has been seeded with microscopic spores in the lab. The gravel is then held in the lab for a few months to let the spores grow. Once the gravel is ready for deployment, they can be tossed over the side of a boat, potentially restoring kilometers at a time. Urchin removals is also a common practice, especially in Northern California. Since there is no top predator present, aka the sea star, it is up to us humans to be the top predator. Scientists, recreational divers, and citizen science divers have been working tirelessly to remove urchins along the North Coast. However, if you know the North Coast of California, you know how dynamic the coast can be, and big waves can make all of these methods incredibly challenging. There are giant waves during the winter, and even during some of the more tame months, there can be giant swells that move through. So far, all of the previously mentioned restoration efforts have been tried. Spore bags were ripped from their bolted substrate. Lines tend to get ripped from their spot by the first storm after deployment. Urchins from the deep just keep crawling into the shallow waters where they've been removed. And green gravel individuals have turned out looking a lot like this, unfortunately, making them susceptible to being picked up by a wave and thrown onto the beach. So as you can see here in my very crude demonstration, when the spores are settled on small little gravel, sometimes they don't attach to the main substrate and they kind of like bob in the middle of the water column for a while. It's quite funny to look at as a diver, but disappointing as a restoration person. So after contemplating all of these challenges, my colleague and I talked about what the ideal method of restoration might look like. What were the big goals and how could we avoid some of these complications that have really challenged some other restoration efforts? We knew we wanted the method to follow the natural pattern of bull kelp reproduction as close as possible. This would mean that the method would not involve a ton of lab work or physical structures that could potentially be more cost-effective than other methods. So none of these and potentially a lower one of these. To better understand our approach though, let's quickly review the bull kelp life history. So like I said, in fall, the adults are dropping their sori or their blades full of spores, and the spores are dispersing onto the rock. During the winter time, those spores are hunkered down and the adults are getting ripped out and put on the beach. In the spring, we finally have these beautiful little babies when they're cued by the sunlight. And by summer, we get these beautiful forests once again. So now that we have had that refresher, let's dive into the spore solution. The first step to the spore solution is to collect sori, or material packed with billions of spores from a local healthy bull kelp forest. Now, there are not many of those left on the North Coast, but our team is aware of 2 or 3 small populations, and that's where we tend to collect from. Step 2, the sori are placed in a bucket of seawater and encouraged to release spores over a period of 3 to 5 hours. In this picture, you can see me transferring the collected sori to the 5-gallon bucket full of seawater. Step 4 involves our, After some time, a small water sample is collected from the seawater bucket and put on a special slide called a hemocytometer. This type of slide was created to count human blood cells. And since spores are around the same size, we use the same microscope slide to count the spores. We can use math to then estimate the total number of spores in the buckets. And then step 4 involves our affectionately named reef duster. This fabricated system uses air pressure to transport the spore solution from that blue jug to the sea floor. Each dispersal is carefully crafted to find the perfect spot to disperse the spores. Typically, we target bare reef that historically had a bull kelp forest. In this next slide, I have a sped up video of what it looks like on the ocean floor when we disperse. This was an experiment, so we were dispersing on sand instead of reef on purpose. I have added a special non-toxic dye to the spore solution so that you can visualize what it actually looks like when we disperse the spores. So let's see if I can make it work. So you can see the spore solution coming out. And the hose is pointed in the west direction. That will be important. Keep that in mind. See how it's kind of sloshing back and forth. Okay. So now let's look at the spore solution in a seasonal context. Since we wanted to mimic the natural bull kelp life cycle, we conduct all the steps I have mentioned so far during the fall. By winter, our dispersed spores are happy and attached to the rock at the bottom of the ocean, waiting for their moment to shine in the coming spring. And by spring, those tiny spores grow into baby bull kelp. And of course, by summer, the adults have grown and are now creating a lush canopy. During the early summer, our collaborators at the Greater Farallones Association, they use a drone to map the canopy cover from the surface, and the imagery created from that helps us measure the success of our method. And when the natural process is placed alongside the spore solution, you can see that the method tracks closely with bull kelp populations persisting out there in the ocean. So far, we have conducted experiments to test the feasibility of this method in Monterey Bay and in Drakes Bay. Our initial results suggest that the method works very well, but further replication is necessary to know for sure. Let's take a quick look at the experiment that we did in Monterey Bay. This is the setup that we created in Monterey Bay. The green boxes represent where our experimental blocks are, and the gray blocks represent the control blocks. They are situated in the four cardinal directions, and they're specific specific distances away from the center where we will disperse. Now you can also see that there's these little small boxes on the main boxes. So the main boxes are cinder blocks, and the teeny tiny boxes are actually small glass microscope slides. We 3D printed little holders for them that will hold them to the cinder blocks so that we can look on a microscopic level if the spores actually settle in the area near where we dispersed. So here's just a very crude photo of what that experimental setup kind of looked like. And this was during the dispersal because the control blocks go in 3 days after we know the spores have settled. That way we can tell if there were any other spores that come into our experimental site from neighboring kelp forests. So remember how I said, watch where the spores are going in that video? That's because in that video, we were looking at the perspective and seeing that the spore solution was originally coming out of the hose in the west direction. So my original hypothesis was that all of the spores were going to end up on the west blocks. However, if you noticed in the video, the water was also sloshing in the east direction. So if you were to keep that in mind, let's look at some of the stats. So there's a lot going on here, but I just want to direct your attention to the circled section here. Notice that the bars are significantly higher here in the east direction than in any other direction. And you can also see how much larger those bars are compared to the control, which is right next to it on the right there. This data is of the tiny spores that were settled on the microscope slides in that eastern direction. This would suggest that the cloud of spores settled down in the east direction. This data suggests that when spores are dispersed on the seafloor, they do settle there. Now, our hope for this method is that it can be used to restore regions of the coastline at a time. We also want to make it straightforward so that other passionate about their coast can get involved and be part of the solution. Can you imagine for a moment, boats out on the ocean with a hose off the back, reef dusting the reefs, just like a crop duster might dust an agricultural field? Okay, realistically, there will be a lot more work that will have to be done before this would ever become a reality. But it is important to think big because thinking about this stream has helped make this project a reality. If you have any questions or would like to learn more about this novel method, I will leave my email at the end of my talk, and I encourage you to reach out. I could talk about kelp and spores all day, so please, please reach out. So we're almost at the end of my talk, and since this is Sea Otter Awareness Week, I can't finish my talk without talking about the charismatic megafauna. Sea otters play an important role in the dynamics of their kelpie home, but the California coast is way more complex than one might realize. The kelp forest system itself is much like a tangled spider web. Yes, I know. I'm on season here. We're into October. I'm so excited. So, all jokes aside, this system is incredibly complex, and it shifts and changes even within the California coast, depending on the temperature, food availability, as well as many other factors I just won't get into today. Don't worry about the photo in front of you. This is just showing you how complex the system really is. So let's take a step back and take a look at the role that sea otters and other predators play in these complex systems and break it down into more digestible information. We can start with the web that most are familiar with. The Central California kelp forest. It experiences a specific dynamic. In the scientific world, what or who controls this dynamic is pretty debated and still has not been determined. However, the general system looks a lot like this. To start, we have the two canopy-forming kelps, the primary foundation. Then we have the secondary creatures, like urchins and abalone. That's not an exhaustive list, that eat the kelp. Then we have the fish on the third tier, and finally, and most importantly, for this talk, we have our otters that rely on the kelp forest for shelter and/or food. So on the Central Coast, in simplistic terms, the otters eat the urchins and help keep the system stable and healthy. However, these dynamics are not the same north and south of the Central Coast. In Southern California, otters aren't really around, so instead the system looks a bit different. Remember, giant kelp was a sole canopy forming kelp, and of course we have our urchins and abalone, along with other secondary players not mentioned here. But on the southern coast, spiny lobster and sheephead tend to dominate the top predator role in the kelp forest. Whoop. Munching on urchins and abalone and keeping the system in balance. In Southern California, otters really aren't around. But these sheephead and lobsters do step in and provide that role. And finally, in Northern California, the kelp forests start off looking similar to the Central Coast. But in this system, the dominant predator was the sunflower sea star and the ochre stars. These two species of sea stars were ferocious predators, eating their fair share of urchins and invertebrates. However, these two species were also the ones that suffered the most when sea star wasting syndrome hit our coast, and their recovery has been trying at best. Like I spoke about earlier, that left the urchins to feast on the kelp, shifting to a very urchin-barren state. And it looks a lot like this, unfortunately. And actually, most of it doesn't even look like this anymore. You won't even see any kelp. You just see a lot of very hungry urchins. The North Coast is now at a very pivotal point. Kelp restoration efforts are ongoing and gaining traction. Red urchin fishers are working around the clock with restoration teams, doing their best to still make a living, removing severely empty and worthless zombie purple urchins. There was a small reprieve in this season in fall, as purple urchins are munching down on the remaining bull kelp, and some fishers have been able to harvest a small amount of uni from that. But will that be enough? They would say probably not. Could reintroducing a top predator help the situation? Who knows? Only time and discussions with all the community stakeholders and lots of science will help determine the best path forward. But for now, my message to all of you who are watching, if you're passionate about your coast and love these golden forests, find ways to get involved and support the lovely humans out there that are doing their best to save what they hold most dear. Even if that means just picking up some trash when you walk along the beach, or learning about the history of our beloved coastal ecosystems from tribal members, fishers, urchin divers, scientists, community members, and other stakeholders. Yes, all of us humans have incredibly diverse opinions, passions, and cultures. But at the end of the day, we are all connected in one giant interconnected web, just like the kelp forest. Thank you so much for your interest and your time, and for being patient with us during our technical difficulties. If you have any questions, I think I have some time left. I'd be happy to answer them.
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. It's so great to hear your talk. We really appreciate it. And I've been hearing about the spore duster, so I'm happy to have seen it in action. That was neat that you showed us some video. So we do have a couple of questions, but before I even get to that, I have a question for you myself. You know, as you mentioned here on the Mendocino coast, it's particularly difficult because urchin are so overpopulated and we don't have a lot of barren reef. So we still need to clear and maintain urchin in order for something like this to happen. Because as you pointed out, you know, when the little sporophytes start to sprout and we get the little lollipops, the urchin just mow them over before they become reproductive. Yeah. So one of the questions that I've continued to have is, are the urchin themselves we know they're scouring the rocks because we have so much bare rock. Are they actually eating the spores as well when they scour the rocks?
That's a great question. And based on my knowledge currently of what's out there, we don't know for sure. There are some studies currently ongoing about how large, microscopic or macroscopic, the spores need to be before the urchins can detect the spores and actually start picking up on them. And on that note too, I mean, when you have a reef that's covered thick with purple urchins, that makes it really hard to disperse. You're going to end up dispersing probably spores onto the urchins' backs, right? So right now, some of our trial experiments have been in places where we have an ROV team that drops down first, make sure there aren't urchins, because there are some bare reefs, especially in Drake's Bay. And we disperse there first to see if it's even a viable option. Our hope someday is that if we just inundate the substrate with just an insane amount of spores, there will be enough to overwhelm the urchins that are there. But you have a great question. It's the same one on my mind. It's going to be tricky. It's
one of the hopeful things of the last couple of years, because we had sort of persistent upwelling here, is we did see some little stands of kelp come up in places we haven't seen since this whole perfect storm hit. So spores are surviving to some extent, but that is sort of one of the big key questions, because as you mentioned, we don't have a predator. So we aren't controlling those purple urchin without human intervention. So let me ask some of the questions, and then maybe I can ask a few more of my own. So somebody asked if there are efforts to bring back the sea stars. An excellent question.
excellent question. And Heather, I'm sure you can chime in on this as well, but I do know there are efforts currently that are happening in a few labs up north that are trying to culture and grow sea stars to get them prepared to be transplanted to the coast. You know, like I tell everyone, we could wait. Nature will eventually switch back. It's been shown over time, the data shows we switch back and forth between these urchin barrens and then a healthy kelp forest. But as I've shared in my presentation, and I'm sure you've heard before, our economy, the people, the community, we can't wait that long. And so that's why all of these efforts are happening now. And the sea stars is one of the big ones that I'm really excited to see what happens with that. So great question.
Yeah, and here in Mendocino, we have seen a rebound of the ochre sea stars a little bit, but we've seen exactly 2 sunflower sea stars in all of our, either the divers, we're trying to get the divers to report them, and we just haven't seen a big rebound in the sunflowers, and they're, as you know, the big one for us. I do know Cal Academy is going to start trying to grow out some of the sea stars, and there's a lab in Monterey as well. But yeah, Friday Harbor Lab has taken the lead on that, and it's not to the point where we can distribute all the little juvenile sea stars that we hope we get. So one day we hope Noyo Center can be a little sea star nursery too. Okay, next question. Do you believe that human intervention, aka kelp restoration, is essential for a kelp forest persisting off the California coast?
Beautiful question. And I believe I sort of already answered it, but I think, besides the fact that I said that us humans really need the kelp forest to come back now rather than in a few years. And I say a few, we don't know when it would come back, but the kelp does create what we would call spore banks, where the spores just will hang out dormant until the conditions are better for itself. There has been a little bit of research on that. But like I said, we really can't wait that long. Wish we could just let nature do its thing, but.
Agreed. And to put a little plug in for Noyo Center, we've been working for a long time, recognizing that we don't have a predator, and we won't for a while, on aquaculture. So purple urchin aquaculture. So turning that empty, worthless urchin into something that is a marketable seafood product that can put the divers back to work and just reduce some of the pressure on the kelp. And so we have a pilot project starting this year that will look at doing that in Noyo Harbor, and hopefully get many more people, like trying to make it as DIY friendly as possible, so as many people can be growing out purple urchin. So that will be great. Okay, then the next question is human intervention necessary, or can urchin barrens fix themselves? You kind of just talked about that, and they do persist for quite some time. It's a hard thing to turn around once they establish.
Yeah.
Do you expect success from the spore solution? Will you just be feeding more urchin?
Great question. I mentioned a little bit about how we're not quite sure at what size those urchins can detect them. And it's quite possible that, yes, we are just providing this lovely Thanksgiving feast for all of the urchins every time we disperse. We don't know yet. These are all very preliminary experiments. It's the first time this has been tried, at least within this area. I know that there has been some experiments up in Oregon trying this as well, but really time is going to tell. I don't know. I know that's not a fun answer to hear, but as a scientist, I have a really hard time giving absolutes. I can tell you that my hope is it will work. And from a kelp perspective, just the biological way that it grows, I have a feeling this could really assist and enhance the distribution of populations along the bull kelp forest coast. Because if you think about it, they all kind of live in like small little pockets and populations. And so their spores are never going to reach really like large distances. And so the whole point of this project is supposed to help enhance their reach geographically by taking some little bit of spores from those healthy populations that are left and distributing their babies along the coast up and down, hopefully connecting these populations that are very isolated at the moment. So who knows? Time will tell.
Yeah. And I think you're right. It's like it requires all of our efforts in every way possible, I think.
A lot of hope.
Okay, and the last question I have are there otters on San Nicolas Island or in Southern California?
That's a Heather question.
Yeah, I can hop in for that one too. First of all, thank you so much, Elizabeth. That is fascinating. I love being able to see the spore solution actually come out. And I'm going to bump in and ask a question. Is that colored? Did you add colors that helps you see? Because I was just thinking like, wow, that like is so concentrated, which I know it is, but it was a really cool visual to see that kind of flow out. But yeah, I will.
The spores are not fluorescent.
That'd be cool.
That would be really great for like communication. You know, it's a non-toxic dye that's very commonly used in the kelp dispersion realm and field. So we use that just so that we can help visualize.
Yeah, no, that was really cool to see. So yeah, I will address, there are sea otters that were translocated to San Nicolas Island. There is it's a healthy population happening right now. And so there's been a lot of research. And I think what's amazing is by having, and that's in Southern California. So yes, there are sea otters in just one spot of Southern California on an island that is not discussed too much, but since they had been reintroduced into that island, there's been a lot of research and this amazing opportunity to learn how sea otters reintroduced into that system impact all what you did so beautifully, sort of layer that different trophic level going down, what happens at those different levels. I do know that there has been some long-term data collection, and it does suggest actually the sea otter effect on the kelp, even in the presence of the sheephead and the lobsters. So still sea otters have that term, the keystone effect, which is just a few individuals have a really big impact. And that's just because sea otters are voracious, just like the sea stars are voracious, sea otters are voracious too. So what is so interesting is I think you highlighted the complexity of the system. And I do love that you broke it from the southern, central, northern, because it's really only in Central California right now that we do still have sea otters. They historically would have been all along that way. So in those sort of images of going up in that trophic system, you could have had that little like, goodbye, otter, not there anymore. So they would have been in that system over 100 years ago. And like Northern California, they've been missing for over 100 years. So they would have had that same sort of effect down, and maybe there would be different prey relationships coming through. But I just think that's important to note that, yeah, that it's definitely so complex. There's still a lot of questions and to learn, but having that project at San Nicolas has given so much insight to how that may be affecting the different trophic levels and how these different, what I would like to call sort of meso predators, maybe they're also keystones to some degree as well at that level, high, a little bit lower than a sea otter, but how they all interconnect and work together to create a really balanced system that ultimately benefits us and fisheries and their home.
Yeah, I feel compelled to say one of the difficulties of thinking about reintroduction of otters on the Northern California coast is because we're so dominated by these empty purple urchin. And they have outcompeted so successfully both the abalone and the red urchin, as you mentioned, both valuable fisheries, recreational and commercial fisheries here. The worry is that if they come here, they'll take the rest of the, they'll further decimate the rest of that population. are those populations of those species. And there isn't a lot of kelp habitat for them to utilize. And so there are a lot of complicating factors to otters being here on the Mendocino coast. And
Absolutely.
but it's a great conversation to continue to have.
Yeah, and I can touch on, I mean, I think you brought up some good points that ultimately, anything around potential reintroduction at this point is not a full proposal. We're having conversations about it and making sure that we want to connect and really learn and hear from the different communities, the stakeholders, those that feel that cultural significance and want that to return, those that have businesses and have concerns, valid concerns about the fact that sea otters do eat urchins. They like the healthy ones that people like to eat as well. But there is amazing work that's been done in Central California during that war in 2014, as that warm water came through and really affected throughout the coastline. And as that sea star wasting disease, decimated the sunflower sea stars, which were one of those munchers of those urchins, even in Central California, there was a bit of a delay that happened with sea otters. So even though we have sea otters that like to eat urchins in really concentrated areas with high populations, they like to specialize. So there's certain otters that were like, I'm really good at eating urchins. I'm really good at eating crabs. I'm really good at eating snails. And so as you had more urchins that were most likely being preyed upon by those sunflower sea stars, the little guys, right? They would eat everything in their path. Those were maybe not focus of sea otters for a little bit, but there was a delay. And so there has been research through Dr. Smith's work that I think I've referenced before in Noyo as well. And I can happy to share that paper with everyone that saw that there was a bit of a delayed reaction, but sea otters did learn to start eating more urchins. And so you have to kind of think like if something just all of a sudden appears and you don't really know what to do with it for a while, there's always going to be a little bit of a learning curve. And so what he discovered was that as those, I'm going to call them wounds, because that's the best way that I know how to describe that, as these barrens, these wounds that did occur, as there was an influx of more urchins since you missed another predator left, you're not going to be focused on the center, right? Where there isn't, if they're not eating the kelp, if they're zombies, as everyone likes to refer to them as, they're a little bit less of the concern as the ones that are eating the kelp right at the edges. And so what was really quickly learned was that sea otters forage right at the edge. And so they're allowing that kelp to kind of heal from the edges. But with that said, you're correct. Sea otters eat urchins. They like the healthy ones. And so that is definitely a concern for certain stakeholders, and why I emphasize, please take the survey that is, I think, added in here. We'll be sharing it at the end once the video is posted as well. We want your questions. We want your concerns. We want your comments. All of this information is also then shared with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other agencies. So your voice matters. We want to hear from all of you in this conversation because it's a discussion.
And I think that's one of the most important points here that Heather makes, and she continues to make. Every person's opinion, thought, perspective is valid and really important to the research that's going into better understanding what the impacts might be if sea otters were to be reintroduced. These kinds of things definitely don't happen overnight. You can see that through all of our history. And especially as a scientist, Heather understands it's going to take a lot of time and effort to even get to a place where we feel confident one way or the other. So kudos to Heather, because I know that this is a really tough topic and she really is trying to make sure the door stays open for everybody. So make your voices heard, take that survey.
All right, well, I don't see any more questions and we're at our time. So I want to thank both Elizabeth and Heather. I can't wait to see a spore duster on the Mendocino coast at some point in the future. Thanks so much for your time and all the good work you're doing, both of you.
Thank you. You too, Sheila.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the Noyo Center for partnering with us on this event. Thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us. And I just want to do a shout out to Trey. Thank you, Trey, for being our behind the scenes. And do not worry, everyone loves a live stream with some bloopers. So yes. I hope everyone had a good laugh at the beginning, but I'm so excited we got to do this presentation, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. It is the last day of Sea Otter Awareness Week, and we wish you all well.